The year was 1887, and spring had come reluctant to the vast Montana territory. The railway station at Willow Creek sat like a weathered sentinel on the edge of endless prairie, its wooden boards groaning under the weight of departing passengers and lingering dreams. Black smoke from the eastbound locomotive still hung in the air, like a funeral shroud, carrying with it the hopes of those who could afford passage to better lives. Among those left behind on the platform stood Millie Harper, 26 years old, and clutching a worn leather satchel as though it contained her very soul. Her dark hair, pinned hastily that morning in the cramped train car, had begun to escape its confines, catching the pale sunlight with strands that spoke of weariness beyond her years. She wore her only good dress, a modest blue wool that had seen too many seasons, and her boots, though polished, bore the scars of 1,000 miles of uncertainty. Millie closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the letters that had brought her here. Dear Miss Harper, they had begun written in the careful script of a man seeking companionship. I am in need of a wife to help tend my ranch and care for my household. I can offer respectability, security, and a home where your efforts will be valued. The words had seemed like salvation after months of scraping together coins as a seamstress in Chicago's tenements, where the smell of desperation clung to every threadbare curtain. But now, as the crowd began to thin and eyes turned toward her with uncomfortable curiosity, the cruel truth revealed itself with the precision of a blade. "You there, miss?" came a voice rough and dismissive. Millie turned to see a red-faced man in a stiff brown coat approaching his belly, straining against brass buttons, and his expression carrying the weight of profound disappointment. Behind him stood two other men, their faces bearing the cruel anticipation of spectators at a hanging. "You're the Harper woman." The man continued, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone within 50 yards. "Yes, sir. I'm Millie Harper." Her voice remained steady despite the trembling in her chest. "You must be Mr. Henley." Thomas Henley looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of a man examining livestock at market. His lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of public condemnation. "Well, I'll be damned," he said loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear every syllable. "The letters said you were comely. They sure as hell didn't mention you were plain as prairie grass and twice as common-looking." A ripple of cruel laughter spread through the onlookers. Millie felt heat flood her cheeks, but she kept her chin raised. She had endured worse humiliations in Chicago landlords who demanded more than rent, employers who promised wages that never came, neighbors who whispered about the seamstress girl who dared to dream above her station. "Mr. Henley," she said quietly, "perhaps we might speak privately." "No need for privacy, miss. I've got eyes and I can see plain enough that you're not what I bargained for." He gestured broadly to the crowd. "I told these folks I was expecting a proper wife, not some worn-out spinster who looks like she's been rode hard and put away wet." The laughter grew louder, more vicious. Millie's hands tightened on her satchel until her knuckles went white. Inside that bag lay everything she owned in the world. 2 spare dresses, a small Bible her mother had given her, the last photograph of her family before consumption, took them all. And the letters from Mr. Henley that had promised her a future. "I understand your disappointment." Millie said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed crowd. "But I have traveled a very long way, sir. Perhaps nothing." Henley turned his back on her with theatrical finality. "I asked for a wife, not a charity case. Good day, miss." He strode away, his companions following with barely concealed grins. The crowd began to disperse, but not before Millie caught fragments of their whispered commentary. "Poor thing, came all this way for nothing. Pride comes before a fall. Bet she ain't got 2 coins to rub together." Eunice Hargrove, the innkeeper's wife, a sharp-featured woman whose tongue was renowned throughout Willow Creek for its cutting edge, leaned close to her companion, Mrs. Abernathy, and spoke just loudly enough for Millie to hear. Well, I never, Eunice declared with barely concealed satisfaction. Even by mail order, she can't keep a man interested. Mark my words, she'll be on the next train east, assuming she's got the fare. What do you suppose she'll do? Mrs. Abernathy whispered back, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern that was quickly overshadowed by morbid curiosity. Lord knows. Girls like that, they usually end up in houses that ain't fit for proper women, if you catch my meaning. The words hit Millie like physical blows. She had heard such implications before, had seen women in Chicago forced into circumstances that stripped away their dignity along with their hope. The thought that she might be heading toward such a fate made her stomach clench with fear. Standing at the far edge of the platform, partially hidden in the shadow of the station house, Richard Callahan observed the cruel theater unfolding before him. At 30 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to bear life's burdens without complaint. His dark hair was touched with premature silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who spent his days under the Montana sun. He had not come to town for a bride. Indeed, he had sworn off such tender complications the night his beloved Catherine died, bringing their daughter into the world. Beside him stood Clara May Callahan, 4 years old, and blessed with her mother's golden curls and bright blue eyes. The child watched the unfolding drama with the intense curiosity that only children possess, her small hand tucked securely in her father's calloused palm. "Papa," Clara May whispered, tugging at his sleeve, "why is everyone being mean to the pretty lady?" Richard's jaw tightened. He had seen enough cruelty in his life to recognize it when it paraded itself as entertainment. His Catherine had been subjected to similar treatment when they first married. Whispers about the poor ranch girl who had dared to reach above her station by marrying the son of one of the territory's more prosperous families. "Sometimes, little one," he said quietly, "people forget their manners." Clara May considered this with the seriousness that children bring to matters of injustice. She watched as Millie stood alone on the platform, her dignity wrapped around her like armor, her face pale but determined. Most of the crowd had dispersed by now, leaving only a few stragglers and the woman who had traveled so far only to be publicly rejected. "She looks lonely, Papa," Clara May observed. "Like how I feel when I wake up in the night and can't remember Mama's voice." The words struck Richard like a physical blow. His daughter rarely spoke of her mother. Catherine had died when Clara May was barely 6 months old, too young to form lasting memories. But lately the child had begun asking questions about the woman whose photograph sat on the mantelpiece, whose presence haunted the ranch house like a gentle ghost. As they watched, Millie gathered what remained of her composure and began walking toward the station house, presumably to inquire about return passage to Chicago. Her steps were measured and careful, but Richard could see the way her shoulders trembled with the effort of maintaining her dignity. It was then that Clara May did something that would change all their lives forever. She broke away from her father's grasp and ran across the platform, her small boots clicking against the wooden boards. Before Richard could stop her, she had positioned herself directly in front of Millie, looking up with those impossibly blue eyes that had inherited all of Catherine's warmth and none of the world's cynicism. "Miss Clara May," said her voice clear and carrying in the afternoon stillness, "you look like you need a family." Millie stopped so suddenly that she nearly stumbled. She looked down at the child, this golden-haired angel, who had appeared as if summoned by her desperate prayers, and felt something crack inside her chest. "Oh, sweetheart," Millie whispered, kneeling down so that she was at eye level with the little girl. "That's very kind of you to say. My papa needs a wife," Clara May announced with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "And I need a mama. Will you marry us?" The few remaining people on the platform fell into stunned silence. Richard strode forward, his face flushing with embarrassment and something that might have been panic. "Clara May," he said firmly, reaching for his daughter's hand. "That's quite enough. You can't just—" But the child pressed on, immune to adult embarrassment. "She has kind eyes, Papa, like how Mama looks in the picture. And she's been crying, but she's trying not to let anyone see. That's brave, isn't it? Millie felt tears threatening to spill over. This child, this perfect innocent child, saw her in ways that no adult had bothered to look. Not as a burden or failure, but as someone deserving of kindness. You are very brave too, Millie said softly, reaching out to touch Clara May's cheek. And very smart. But your papa might not. Papa's lonely too. Clara May interrupted. He talks to Mama's picture when he thinks I'm sleeping. And sometimes he sits on the porch and looks so sad that I want to hug him, but he gets all stiff when I try. Richard's face had gone pale. The casual way his daughter exposed his private grief left him feeling raw and vulnerable before this stranger's eyes. He reached for Clara May more urgently. That's enough, little one. We need to be getting home. But as he lifted his daughter into his arms, Clara May leaned toward Millie with desperate urgency. Don't go away, she pleaded. Please don't get on the train. We have a house, and Papa makes good food, and I have a doll that needs a mama too. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Millie rose slowly, her eyes meeting Richard's for the first time. She saw pain there and wariness, but also something else, a recognition of shared sorrow that needed no explanation. I'm sorry, Richard said quietly, his voice rough with embarrassment. She doesn't understand. She understands perfectly. Millie interrupted gently. Children see things that adults miss. She paused, studying his face. The question is, Mr. Callahan, Richard Callahan. The question is, Mr. Callahan, whether you're brave enough to listen to her. The challenge hung between them, weighted with possibility and fraught with risk. Richard found himself studying this woman, who had been so publicly humiliated, yet stood before him with quiet dignity, intact. Her eyes were indeed kind, as Clara May had observed, but they also held a strength that spoke of survival against odds that would have broken weaker souls. I don't know you, he said finally. No, Millie agreed. You don't. But your daughter seems to think that matters less than you might imagine. Eunice Hargrove, who had been listening to this exchange with growing disapproval, chose that moment to insert herself into the conversation. Richard Callahan, you can't seriously be considering. She began, her voice shrill with outrage. I can consider whatever I choose, Mrs. Hargrove. Richard replied, his tone carrying a warning that made the older woman step back. He looked at Millie again, then at his daughter, who was watching the adults with the intense focus of someone whose entire future might hang on the next few moments. Miss Harper, he said finally, would you do us the honor of joining us for supper? It's getting late, and the next train east doesn't come through until Thursday. Millie felt her heart leap, but she forced herself to remain calm. That's very kind, Mr. Callahan. But I wouldn't want to impose. You wouldn't be imposing, Clara May declared. You'd be answering prayers. The innocence and certainty in the child's voice silenced any objections. Richard extended his hand to help Millie into the wagon, and she took it, feeling the calloused strength of fingers that spoke of honest labor and steady character. As they drove away from the station, Millie caught sight of Eunice Hargrove's scandalized expression and Thomas Henley's bewildered face. Part of her wanted to turn back to explain that she wasn't trying to trap another man into marriage, that she understood the difference between charity and genuine affection. But Clara May's small hand slipped into hers, warm and trusting. And Millie decided that explanations could wait. For the first time in months, she was traveling toward something instead of away from everything she had lost. The Callahan Ranch sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, surrounded by rolling hills that stretched toward mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The house was modest, but well built, with a wide porch that faced west toward the sunset, and windows that glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, all bearing the marks of careful maintenance despite their age. "It's not much," Richard said as he helped Millie down from the wagon, "but it's home. It's beautiful." Millie replied, and meant it. After years in Chicago's cramped tenements, the open space felt like a gift. She could hear cattle lowing in the distance, and the gentle whisper of wind through grass that stretched as far as the eye could see. Inside the house was clean, but clearly lacking a woman's touch. The furniture was sturdy and functional, the floors swept but not scrubbed, the windows clear, but without curtains. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and above the mantelpiece hung a photograph of a young woman with gentle eyes and a serene smile. Clara May followed Millie's gaze. "That's Mama," she said simply. "Papa says she's in heaven, but sometimes I think she's just hiding and might come back if we're very good." Richard's jaw tightened, and Millie could see the fresh grief that still lived in his eyes when he looked at his wife's image. "She's very beautiful," Millie said softly. "You have her eyes, and her stubborn streak." Richard added, ruffling his daughter's hair with the first genuine smile Millie had seen from him. Supper was a simple affair, beef stew and fresh bread that Richard had obviously prepared himself. The conversation was stilted, at first weighted with the awareness that they were strangers, thrust together by circumstance and a child's innocent intervention. "Tell me about Chicago," Richard said eventually, clearly trying to fill the silence. Millie's hand stilled on her spoon. "What would you like to know? What brought you west, besides the obvious, I mean?" She was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth to share. "I was a seamstress. After my family died, consumption took them all within 6 months. I found it difficult to make ends meet. The work was hard, the pay was poor, and..." She paused, remembering things she had hoped to forget. There were men who assumed that a woman alone was available for more than sewing. Richard's expression darkened. "I see. I answered several advertisements for wives." Millie continued, her voice steady, despite the shame that still clung to the memory. "Mr. Henley's letters were the most promising. He wrote about wanting a partner, someone to help build a life. I suppose I was naive to believe that such things were possible." "Maybe not naive," Richard said quietly. "Maybe just hopeful. There's a difference." Clara May, who had been listening with the intense concentration that children bring to adult conversations, suddenly spoke up. "Papa can miss Millie's sleep in the spare room, the one with the quilt Grandma made." Richard's cheeks flushed. "Clara May, Miss Harper might prefer to stay in town?" "No," Millie said quickly. "I mean, if you wouldn't mind, I would be grateful for a place to stay until the Thursday train." She paused, meeting his eyes. "I can help with cooking and cleaning. I don't expect charity." "It's not charity," Richard replied. "It's common decency." That night, lying in the spare room under a quilt that spoke of loving hands and careful stitches, Millie stared at the ceiling and wondered what she was doing. This was not the life she had planned when she boarded the train in Chicago. She had expected to be settling into her own home with a husband who, if not passionate, would at least be kind and respectful. Instead, she found herself a guest in the home of a man who was still mourning his wife, and a child who seemed determined to adopt her as a replacement mother. From the next room, she could hear Richard moving about the soft creak of floorboards and the gentle sounds of a father checking on his sleeping daughter. There was something deeply comforting about those domestic sounds, a sense of safety and stability that Millie had not felt since her family's death. She was nearly asleep when she heard Clara May cry out. The sound was sharp and frightened, the kind of nightmare wail that cuts through the darkness like a blade. Millie was out of bed and in the hallway before she had fully awakened, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She met Richard coming out of his own room, his hair tousled and his shirt hastily pulled on. They stood in the hallway for a moment, both uncertain of the proper boundaries in this unusual situation. "Papa?" Clara May's voice called out thick with tears. "I'll go," Richard said, but Millie was already moving toward the child's room. She found Clara May sitting up in her small bed, tears streaming down her cheeks and her golden curls damp with perspiration. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Millie asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and reaching out to touch the child's forehead. "I dreamed that you went away." Clara May sobbed. "I dreamed that you got on the train and left, and Papa was sad again, and I couldn't remember what Mama's voice sounded like, and everything was dark and lonely." Millie's heart clenched. She gathered the little girl into her arms, feeling the small body tremble with the force of tears that seemed too large for such a tiny person. "Oh, baby," she whispered, rocking Clara May gently. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere tonight." "But you will," Clara May hiccuped. "You'll get on the Thursday train, and I'll be alone again." From the doorway, Richard watched this scene unfold with an emotion he couldn't name. There was something achingly familiar about the sight of a woman comforting his daughter, something that awakened memories he had tried so hard to bury. Catherine had held Clara May just like this during her brief 6 months of life, with that same instinctive tenderness that seemed to come so naturally to some women. "Shh," Millie murmured, smoothing Clara May's hair. "Let's not worry about Thursday tonight. Tonight I'm here and you're safe, and your Papa is taking good care of both of us." "Will you sing to me?" Clara May asked. "Mama used to sing. Papa told me so." Millie glanced toward the doorway, where Richard stood seeking permission. He nodded slightly, and she began to hum a lullaby her own mother had sung to her years ago. Her voice was soft and sweet, carrying a melody that spoke of home and safety and love that endures beyond death. Clara May's tears gradually subsided, and her breathing deepened into the rhythm of approaching sleep. But she clung to Millie's hand with desperate intensity, as if afraid that loosening her grip might cause this new source of comfort to vanish. "Stay," Clara May whispered as her eyes began to close. "Please stay until I'm asleep." "Of course, sweetheart." Millie remained on the edge of the bed, holding the child's hand and humming softly until Clara May's breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of peaceful sleep. Only then did she carefully extract her hand and tiptoe toward the door, where Richard still stood watching. They walked to the kitchen in silence, both of them aware that something significant had just occurred. Richard put water on the stove for coffee, his movements automatic and well-practiced. "She doesn't usually have nightmares," he said finally. "She's had a lot of changes today," Millie replied. "Children process things differently than adults do. She's become very attached to you very quickly." Millie heard the concern in his voice and understood it. "I don't want to make things more difficult for either of you. If you think it would be better, I can stay in town until Thursday." Richard was quiet for a long moment, pouring coffee into 2 cups and setting one before her. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Tell me about your family, the ones who died." The change of subject was abrupt, but Millie understood what he was asking. He needed to know who she was, what kind of person he was allowing into his home and his daughter's heart. "My parents owned a small farm in Illinois." She began wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Nothing grand, but it was home. I had 2 younger brothers, Thomas and James. The consumption came during a particularly hard winter. Papa got sick first, then Mama while she was nursing him. The boys followed within weeks of each other." Her voice remained steady, but Richard could see the pain that lived in her eyes when she spoke of her loss. "How old were you?" 22. "Old enough to be on my own, but young enough to feel lost without them." She took a sip of coffee. "I sold the farm to pay for the burials and the debts. What was left barely covered passage to Chicago and rent for a tiny room in a boarding house. No other family, none that claimed me." The bitterness in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable. "My father's brother made it clear that he had his own family to worry about. My mother's people were back east, and we had lost touch years before. Richard nodded, recognizing the familiar story of abandonment that seemed to follow tragedy like a shadow. What was it like in Chicago? Millie was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Lonely. The kind of loneliness that eats at you from the inside until you start to forget what it felt like to matter to someone. She looked up at him. I imagine you know something about that. He did know. The months after Catherine's death had been filled with a silence so profound that he sometimes found himself speaking aloud just to hear a human voice. If not for Clara May's needs forcing him to function, he might have simply retreated from the world entirely. Yes, he said simply, I do. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people who had learned that grief was a country with its own language, its own customs, its own terrible intimacy. She misses having a mother, Richard said eventually, nodding toward Clara May's room. And you miss having a wife. The statement hung between them, frank and unadorned. Richard didn't deny it, but neither did he confirm it. It's not that simple, he said finally. No, Millie agreed. It never is. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of golden light that made the Montana landscape look like something from a painting. Millie woke to the sound of Richard moving about in the kitchen and the soft murmur of Clara May's voice as she chattered to her father about her dreams. When Millie emerged from the spare room, dressed in her second-best dress and with her hair pinned neatly back, she found Clara May sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of eggs and bacon before her. Miss Millie. The child called out, her face lighting up with joy. Papa made extra breakfast for you. Richard glanced up from the stove, his expression carefully neutral. I hope you slept well. Very well, thank you. Millie accepted the plate he offered and took a seat across from Clara May. This looks wonderful. The meal was comfortable in a way that surprised all of them. Clara May chattered about the ranch animals and her favorite hiding places, while Richard occasionally added details or corrections to her enthusiastic descriptions. Millie found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months, enjoying the simple pleasure of being part of a family breakfast. After the meal, Richard excused himself to attend to the morning chores, leaving Millie and Clara May alone in the kitchen. Miss Millie, Clara May said, climbing down from her chair and approaching with the solemn expression that children wear when they have something important to discuss. Do you like it here? I do, Millie replied honestly. It's peaceful, and your father is very kind. He is, Clara May agreed. But he's sad a lot. Sometimes I catch him looking at Mama's picture with tears in his eyes, but when he sees me watching, he pretends he's fine. The child's perception was startling in its accuracy. Millie knelt down so that she was at Clara May's eye level. Your papa loves your mama very much, she said gently. When someone we love dies, part of our heart goes with them. That doesn't mean we can't love other people, but the missing piece always stays missing. Clara May considered this with the seriousness that children bring to life's mysteries. Do you have missing pieces too? Yes, sweetheart, I do. Maybe, Clara May said with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of babes. Maybe people with missing pieces should stick together. That way the holes don't feel so big. Before Millie could respond to this profound observation, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A group of riders was coming up the road toward the house, and even from a distance, Millie could see that their bearing was not friendly. Richard emerged from the barn at the sound of hoofbeats, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. The lead rider was Thomas Henley, flanked by two men Millie didn't recognize, and to her dismay, Eunice Hargrove riding side saddle on a bay mare. Callahan, Henley called out as the group pulled up in front of the house. We need to talk. Richard's expression remained calm, but Millie could see the tension in his shoulders. Then talk, Henley. But do it respectfully. You're on my property. Henley dismounted, his face red with a combination of exertion and indignation. "This is about that woman you took in. People are talking, Richard. They're saying you've gone soft in the head taking up with a woman who's been God knows where, done God knows what. What people say is their business." Richard replied evenly. "What happens on my ranch is mine." Eunice Hargrove, who had been silent until now, chose this moment to speak up. "Richard, dear, I know you mean well, but you have to think about Clara May. What kind of influence is that woman going to have on an impressionable child?" From inside the house, Millie watched this exchange with growing dread. She had hoped that her presence might go unnoticed for a few days, giving her time to decide what to do next. Instead, it seemed that the gossip mill had been working overtime. Clara May tugged at Millie's skirt. "Why are they angry?" she whispered. "Some people don't like change," Millie replied, though the explanation felt inadequate even to her own ears. Outside, Henley was warming to his subject. "You don't know anything about her, Richard. She could be a thief, a whore, a criminal running from the law. Hell, she could have diseases that would spread to your daughter." The last accusation crossed a line that Richard would not tolerate. In one swift movement, he closed the distance between himself and Henley, his hand now openly resting on his gun. "I'll give you one chance to take that back." Richard said, his voice deadly quiet. But Eunice Hargrove, apparently emboldened by the presence of her male companions, pressed on with the attack. Everyone knows what kind of woman answers those mail-order advertisements. She declared, her voice shrill with righteous indignation. "Desperate women with questionable pasts and loose morals. Why, I heard tell that this particular woman was dismissed from her position in Chicago for conduct unbecoming. Something about stealing from her employer and carrying on with a married man." The words hit Millie like physical blows. She had never stolen anything in her life, and the married man Eunice was referring to had been her employer's son, who had made unwanted advances that she had firmly rebuffed. But she could see how such a story might be twisted into something sordid and damaging. Richard's face had gone white with anger. "You'd better have proof of those accusations, Mrs. Hargrove. Because if you're spreading lies about a guest in my home, you and I are going to have a serious problem." "Oh, I have proof, all right," Eunice said with malicious satisfaction. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "This came on this morning's telegraph from a friend of mine in Chicago. Seems Miss Harper left quite an impression on the folks back there." She handed the paper to Henley, who unfolded it and began to read aloud with obvious relish. "Millie Harper dismissed from employment with the Worthington family under suspicious circumstances. Accused of theft and inappropriate conduct with family member. Left town hastily to avoid scandal. Character highly questionable." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. Millie felt the strength drain from her legs, and she had to grasp the windowsill to keep from falling. Richard snatched the telegram from Henley's hands and read it for himself, his expression growing darker with each word. When he looked up, his eyes found Millie's through the window, and she saw something die in his gaze, the tentative trust that had been growing between them, the possibility of a future that had seemed so close just moments before. "Miss Harper." Richard called, his voice formal and cold. "Would you step outside, please?" Millie's hands were shaking as she opened the door and walked onto the porch. Clara May tried to follow, but Millie gently pushed her back inside. "Stay in the house, sweetheart," she whispered. She faced the group of accusers with her chin raised and her spine straight, though inside she felt as though she were crumbling into dust. "Is it true?" Richard asked, his voice devoid of the warmth that had begun to creep into it over the past 24 hours. Millie looked at the faces surrounding her. Henley's triumphant smirk, Eunice's malicious satisfaction, Richard's hurt and angry confusion. She could deny the accusations, could try to explain the twisted version of events that had somehow made their way into a telegram, but she could see in their eyes that they had already judged and convicted her. "The facts are more complicated than they appear," she said quietly. That's not what I asked. Richard replied harshly. I asked if it's true that you were dismissed for theft and improper conduct. Millie closed her eyes for a moment, gathering the courage to face this final humiliation. When she opened them again, she spoke with quiet dignity. I was dismissed from the Worthington household, yes, but not for the reasons stated in that telegram. Then explain, Richard demanded. Millie looked at the hostile faces surrounding her and realized that no explanation would be sufficient. They had already decided who she was and what she was capable of. Her words would only provide them with more ammunition to use against her. I don't believe that would serve any purpose, she said finally. Her refusal to defend herself was taken as an admission of guilt. Henley snorted with satisfaction, while Eunice practically glowed with vindicated righteousness. I think... Richard said, his voice carefully controlled. It would be best if you collected your things and left with these folks. I'm sure Mr. Henley would be happy to drive you back to town. The words struck Millie like a physical blow, but she refused to let them see her break. She nodded, once her composure intact, despite the agony that was tearing through her chest. Of course, she said quietly. I'll just get my satchel. She turned to go back into the house, but Clara May was standing in the doorway, her blue eyes wide with confusion and fear. Miss Millie, the child whispered. Where are you going? Millie knelt down and took Clara May's small hands in hers, fighting back tears that threatened to destroy what remained of her composure. I have to go away, sweetheart, she said gently. But I want you to remember that you are the bravest, kindest little girl I have ever met. And someday you're going to grow up to be an amazing woman. But you said you wouldn't leave? Clara May protested, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. You said you were here and I was safe. I know, baby. I'm sorry. Sometimes grown-ups have to do things that don't make sense to children. Millie kissed Clara May's forehead and hurried past her into the house before her resolve could crumble entirely. She gathered her few possessions, quickly shoving them into her satchel, with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the buckles. When she emerged from the house, Clara May was clinging to Richard's leg, sobbing with the heartbroken intensity that only children can achieve. Papa, don't let her go, she pleaded. Please don't let her go. She makes the house feel like home again. Richard's face was like granite, but Millie could see the pain in his eyes as he looked down at his daughter. For a moment she thought he might reconsider, might ask her to stay, and explain what had really happened in Chicago. But then Eunice Hargrove spoke up again, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Oh, poor little thing. It's hard when children get attached to the wrong sort of people. But she'll forget soon enough, and you'll be able to find her a proper stepmother when the time is right. The moment passed. Richard's expression hardened again, and he avoided meeting Millie's eyes as she walked past him toward Henley's wagon. The ride back to town was conducted in silence, broken only by Henley's occasional comments about women who don't know their place and the importance of proper moral standards. Millie sat in the back of the wagon, her satchel clutched in her lap, and watched the Callahan ranch disappear behind them. At the station, Henley made a great show of purchasing her a ticket on the next eastbound train, as if his generosity might somehow absolve him of his earlier cruelty. Millie accepted the ticket without comment and found a seat on a bench in the waiting area. As the afternoon wore on and the time for the train's departure approached, Millie found herself thinking not about her own situation, but about Clara May. The child had been abandoned by her mother through death, and now by Millie through circumstances beyond anyone's control. The pattern of loss that seemed to follow that little girl was heartbreaking. She was so lost in these thoughts that she almost didn't notice the commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of running feet, the general chaos that indicated something was seriously wrong. Fire, someone shouted. Fire at the Callahan place. Millie was on her feet and running before she had consciously decided to move. She pushed through the crowd that was gathering outside the station, her heart pounding with a fear that transcended her own troubles. A rider had just arrived in town, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. "It's bad," he was telling Sheriff Amos and the other men who had gathered around him. Lightning struck the barn and the fire's spreading toward the house. Richard's trying to save the cattle, but he can't be everywhere at once. "What about the little girl?" someone called out. "Last I saw, she was in the house. But that was 15 minutes ago and the wind's picking up. If those flames reach the main building..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone present could imagine the horror of a wooden house going up in flames with a child trapped inside. Sheriff Amos was already organizing a group of men to ride out and help with the fire. But Millie knew that by the time they arrived, it might be too late. She looked around desperately, searching for a horse, a wagon, anything that could get her to the ranch faster than the sheriff's party. "Please," she said, grabbing the arm of the rider who had brought the news. "I need your horse." He looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Lady, I just rode this animal near to death getting here. Besides, there's nothing you could do that the men can't handle better." "That little girl needs me," Millie said desperately. "She's probably terrified and she doesn't understand what's happening. Please, I'm begging you." The man looked at her more closely, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're the one who was staying with Richard. The one who left today." "Yes," Millie said impatiently. "Does that matter?" "I heard tell you weren't the sort of woman decent folks should associate with." The words stung, but Millie pushed past them. "I don't care what you've heard. A child's life is in danger, and I'm the closest thing to a mother she's had in 4 years. Now please let me borrow your horse." Something in her voice, or perhaps the desperation in her eyes, must have convinced him. He handed her the reins with obvious reluctance. "You know how to ride?" he asked. "I'll manage," Millie replied, though she had never ridden anything more spirited than her father's old plow horse. She hiked up her skirts and mounted the animal with more determination than skill. The horse, sensing her inexperience, pranced nervously, but Millie managed to keep her seat and point him in the direction of the ranch. The ride seemed to take forever, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Long before she reached the house, Millie could see the orange glow on the horizon and smell the acrid smoke that spoke of destruction and loss. The scene that greeted her was like something from a nightmare. The barn was completely engulfed in flames, sending sparks and burning debris into the air with each gust of wind. The fire had spread to the grass between the barn and the house, creating a wall of flame that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Richard was nowhere to be seen, though she could hear cattle bawling in panic from somewhere beyond the smoke. The house was still intact, but flames were licking at the porch roof, and it was clear that the entire structure would be consumed within minutes. Millie dismounted and ran toward the house, calling Clara May's name. The heat was intense, and the smoke made her eyes water and her throat burn. But she pressed on. "Clara May," she screamed. "Clara May, where are you?" A faint cry came from somewhere inside the house, a sound so weak that she might have imagined it, if not for the desperate hope that drove her forward. The front door was already hot to the touch, but Millie managed to force it open. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, and she could hear the ominous crackle of flames that were much closer than they should have been. She found Clara May huddled under her bed, clutching her doll and sobbing with terror. The child's face was streaked with soot and tears, and she was coughing from the smoke that was beginning to fill the room. "Miss Millie." Clara May gasped, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "You came back?" "Of course I came back," Millie said, crawling under the bed and gathering the child into her arms. "Did you think I would leave you when you needed me?" She carried Clara May toward the door, but flames were already blocking their path. The heat was becoming unbearable, and she could hear the sound of burning timber groaning overhead. Moving quickly, she carried Clara May to the bedroom window and forced it open. The drop to the ground was significant, but not impossible. The flames hadn't reached this side of the house yet, though smoke was pouring from the roof just above them. "I'm going to lower you down," Millie told Clara May. "I want you to run as far from the house as you can and wait for me, all right?" Clara May nodded, though her grip on Millie's dress suggested she had no intention of letting go. Millie managed to get the child safely to the ground, but as she prepared to follow, a burning beam crashed down behind her, sending up a shower of sparks and blocking her path back into the room. The window frame itself was beginning to smoke, and she realized that she had only seconds before this escape route would be cut off as well. She was halfway through the window when she heard Richard's voice shouting her name. He appeared around the corner of the house, his face black with soot, and his shirt singed from fighting the flames. "Millie, get out of there." She dropped to the ground just as the window frame burst into flames. Richard reached them a moment later, scooping Clara May into his arms and checking her for injuries with desperate urgency. "Are you hurt, baby?" he asked, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. "Miss Millie saved me, Papa," Clara May said, coughing but otherwise unharmed. "She came back just like she promised." Richard's eyes met Millie's over his daughter's head, and she saw something there that hadn't been present earlier that day, a recognition of who she really was, beneath the lies and accusations that had driven them apart. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried a weight of meaning that went far beyond gratitude. The house was completely consumed by flames within 10 minutes of their escape. They watched from a safe distance as the structure that had been Richard's home for 6 years collapsed into burning rubble. The barn was already gone, and several outbuildings had caught fire as well. Sheriff Amos and his men arrived just as the roof fell in, bringing with them buckets and shovels that would be useless against the inferno that had consumed the Callahan homestead. "Is everyone all right?" the sheriff called out, dismounting and hurrying toward them. "We're alive," Richard replied, his arm still around Clara May, who seemed determined not to let either adult out of her sight. "What about the livestock?" "I managed to get most of the cattle moved to the far pasture before the fire spread," Richard said. "Lost some chickens and probably a few head that bolted, but it could have been worse." Sheriff Amos nodded, then turned to Millie with an expression of grudging respect. "Heard you rode out here on Tom Bradley's horse. Heard you went into a burning house to save the little one." "Anyone would have done the same," Millie replied quietly. "No," the sheriff said. "They wouldn't have. Takes a particular kind of courage to run toward a fire instead of away from it." He studied her face in the flickering light of the dying flames. "Also heard some disturbing stories about you today. Stories that don't square with what I just witnessed." Before Millie could respond, Richard spoke up. "Sheriff, I'd like to know more about those stories myself, particularly where they came from and whether anyone bothered to verify them before spreading them around town." The sheriff's expression grew thoughtful. "As a matter of fact, I did send a wire to Chicago this afternoon asking for more information about Miss Harper's situation there. Got a response about an hour ago." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded telegram. "Seems the first wire Mrs. Hargrove received was somewhat incomplete." He handed the paper to Richard, who unfolded it and read aloud. "Millie Harper, employed by Worthington family for 2 years. Exemplary character and work ethic. Dismissed due to false accusations made by employer's son after she rejected his improper advances. Local church and former neighbors attest to her integrity and moral character. No criminal charges or questionable conduct. Highly recommended." The words seemed to hang in the air, stark in their contradiction of the earlier accusations. Richard looked up at Millie, and she could see the shame and regret in his eyes. "Why didn't you defend yourself this afternoon?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you tell us the truth?" Millie was quiet for a long moment, watching the last of the flames consume what had been their refuge just hours before. "Because I've learned that people hear what they want to hear," she said finally. "And because I thought that maybe just once someone might choose to trust me without requiring proof." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Richard had failed that test, had allowed fear and gossip to override his own instincts about her character. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could hear the genuine regret in his voice. "I should have—" "Hey, Papa." Clara May interrupted, tugging at his shirt with urgent insistence. "Papa, we don't have a house anymore." The practical implications of their situation were just beginning to sink in. Richard's home, his barn, most of his worldly possessions, all of it was gone, reduced to ash and memory in the space of a few hours. "We'll manage, little one," Richard said, though his voice carried the weight of uncertainty. "We'll figure something out." Sheriff Amos cleared his throat. "Richard, you and Clara May are welcome to stay with me and the missus until you can make other arrangements. It's not much, but it's a roof and 4 walls. "That's very kind of you, Sheriff. We're grateful." "What about Miss Harper?" Clara May asked, looking between the adults with worried eyes. "Where will she stay?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Millie's presence had already caused enough controversy for one day, and her involvement in the rescue didn't erase the social complications of the situation. "I believe there's still room at the inn," Sheriff Amos said carefully. "No," Clara May said firmly, her voice carrying the stubborn determination that Richard had learned to recognize and respect. "Miss Millie stays with us. She saved my life, and Papa said we never abandon family." Clara May. Richard began, but his daughter cut him off. "She is family, Papa. Maybe not the same kind as Mama was, but family all the same. And family sticks together, especially when bad things happen." The wisdom in the child's words was undeniable, but the practical difficulties remained. A single man and an unmarried woman could not share accommodations without creating a scandal that would follow them for years. It was Millie who provided the solution. "Mr. Callahan," she said formally, "I realize that this is highly irregular, and I understand if you feel it's inappropriate. But given the circumstances and considering what we've all been through today, I would like to make a proposal." Richard raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "Marry me," she said simply. "Not for love, not for passion, but for practical reasons. You need someone to help you rebuild and care for Clara May. I need a home and a future. We've both been alone long enough to know that solitude isn't sustainable, and today proved that we work well together in a crisis." The proposal was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of romantic sentiment, that it took Richard a moment to process what she was suggesting. "You're proposing a marriage of convenience," he said slowly. "I'm proposing a partnership," Millie corrected. "Two people who have been hurt by life, joining forces to build something better for themselves and for Clara May." Clara May, who had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement, clapped her hands together with delight. "Yes," she exclaimed. "Oh, please say yes, Papa. Miss Millie makes everything better, and she loves me, and she's brave, and she smells like flowers, and she sings pretty songs, and—" "Slow down, little one," Richard said, though he was smiling for the first time since the fire began. "This is a big decision." He looked at Millie, studying her face in the dying light of the flames. She was soot-streaked and exhausted, her hair falling loose from its pins and her dress torn from their escape through the window. But her eyes were steady and clear, and he could see the strength that had carried her through so many trials. "You're certain about this?" he asked. "I'm certain that we're better together than we are apart," she replied. "I'm certain that Clara May deserves a stable home with 2 parents who care about her welfare. And I'm certain that I would rather build a life with someone I respect than spend the rest of my days wondering what might have been." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was something equally valuable, an honest assessment of their situation and a practical solution to their mutual needs. Richard extended his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation. "Miss Harper," he said formally, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Mr. Callahan," she replied with equal formality. "I would be delighted to accept your proposal." Clara May let out a whoop of joy that could probably be heard back in town, and even Sheriff Amos found himself smiling at the scene. Well then, the sheriff said, "I suppose congratulations are in order. When were you thinking of making this official?" Richard and Millie looked at each other, and some unspoken communication passed between them. "As soon as possible," Richard said. "Tomorrow, if you can arrange it." "Tomorrow it is," Sheriff Amos agreed. "I'll speak to Pastor McKenna in the morning." They were married the next afternoon in the little church at the center of Willow Creek, with Sheriff Amos standing as witness and Clara May serving as an enthusiastic flower girl. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, conducted before a small gathering of townspeople who had come out of curiosity as much as respect. Eunice Hargrove was notably absent, though her husband Jonas attended and even offered his congratulations afterward. Thomas Henley made an appearance, clearly uncomfortable, but apparently feeling obligated to witness the union he had inadvertently set in motion. Pastor McKenna, a kind-eyed man in his 60s, had insisted on meeting with the couple beforehand to discuss the seriousness of the vows they were about to take. "Marriage is not something to be entered into lightly," he had told them that morning. "Even a practical arrangement requires commitment, trust, and mutual respect. Are you both prepared for that level of dedication?" "We are," Richard had replied, and Millie had nodded her agreement. "And you understand that a marriage begun for practical reasons may evolve into something deeper over time. Are you both open to that possibility?" Richard and Millie had exchanged glances, and Millie had spoken for both of them. "We understand that life rarely turns out the way we plan," she had said. "But we're willing to see where this path leads us." Now standing before the altar with Clara May beaming at them from the front pew, where they repeated the traditional vows with quiet sincerity. When Richard slipped a simple gold band onto Millie's finger, purchased that morning from the town's jeweler, she felt a sense of rightness that surprised her with its intensity. "You may kiss the bride," Pastor McKenna announced, and Richard leaned forward to press a gentle, respectful kiss to Millie's lips. It was their first kiss, and while it lacked the passion of a romantic courtship, it carried the weight of promise and the seeds of something that might in time grow into love. The reception was held in the church hall with food provided by the women of the congregation and music supplied by old Pete Morrison and his fiddle. Clara May danced with anyone who would partner her joy infectious, and her laughter filling the room with the sound of celebration. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away, Richard found himself standing with his new wife on the church steps, watching the sun set over the Montana territory. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "None," Millie replied, and she meant it. Only that it took a fire to bring us to our senses," Richard said. "We wasted time on doubts and gossip when we could have been building something together." Clara May appeared at their side, tired but happy, her small hand slipping into Millie's, with the easy trust that had marked their relationship from the beginning. "Are we going home now?" she asked. Richard and Millie looked at each other and smiled. They were staying temporarily with Sheriff Amos and his wife, but already they had begun making plans to rebuild on the ranch. It would take time and hard work, but they would create a new home together, one that belonged to all three of them. "Yes, sweetheart," Millie said, lifting Clara May into her arms. "We're going home." As they walked through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, past the buildings that glowed warmly in the lamplight, and toward the temporary shelter that would have to suffice until they could build something permanent, Millie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west as a mail-order bride, seeking security and respectability, only to be publicly rejected and humiliated. She had been falsely accused and driven away from the first real happiness she had known in years. She had risked her life to save a child who wasn't even her own, and in doing so had found not just redemption, but a genuine chance at the family she had always dreamed of. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that young girls imagined when they dreamed of marriage. There had been no passionate courtship, no declarations of undying love, no promises of eternal romance. But there was something perhaps more valuable, the foundation of respect, trust, and shared purpose upon which a lasting partnership could be built. 6 months later, as Millie stood in the doorway of their new house and watched Richard teaching Clara May to ride her first pony, she realized that love didn't always announce itself with fanfare and dramatic gestures. Sometimes it grew quietly in the spaces between shared meals and everyday conversations, in the comfort of waking up beside someone who had chosen to build a life with you, in the simple pleasure of watching a child grow up secure in the knowledge that she was wanted and valued. Richard caught her watching and smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face and reminding her of the man he must have been before grief had carved its lines around his eyes. He said something to Clara May and walked over to where Millie stood, slipping his arms around her waist with the easy affection that had developed between them over the months of rebuilding their lives. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Very," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "You, more than I ever thought I'd be again," he admitted. "Clara May asked me yesterday if I thought her mama would approve of you." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that any woman who could love her daughter the way you do would be grateful to know that Clara May was in such good hands." The words brought tears to Millie's eyes. In the months since their marriage, she had worried sometimes that she was trying to take the place of a woman she could never replace, that her love for Clara May might somehow be seen as presumptuous or inadequate. "I never want to diminish Catherine's memory," she said quietly. "You don't," Richard assured her. "You honor it. Every time you braid Clara May's hair, every time you sing her to sleep, every time you show her what it means to be a strong, kind woman, you're giving her gifts that Catherine would have wanted her to have." Clara May came galloping over on her pony, her cheeks flushed with excitement, and her golden hair streaming behind her like a banner. "Did you see me, Mama Millie?" she called out, using the name that had evolved naturally over the months. "Did you see how fast Thunder and I went?" "I saw," Millie replied, opening her arms to catch the child as she slid down from the pony's back. "You looked like you were flying." "Papa says that next year I'll be big enough to help with the cattle roundup," Clara May announced proudly. "He says I'm getting to be quite the little cowgirl." "Your papa's right," Millie agreed, smoothing Clara May's hair back from her face. "But for now, I think this little cowgirl needs to wash up for supper." As they walked toward the house together, Richard leading Thunder to the barn, Clara May chattering about her plans for the next day, and Millie listening with the contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong. She thought about the woman she had been when she first stepped off the train in Willow Creek. That woman had been looking for someone to save her, someone to provide security and respectability, and a place in the world. Instead, she had found something much more valuable, the opportunity to save herself, and in doing so to become part of something larger and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined. The mail-order bride who had been rejected on a railway platform had become a wife, a mother, and a respected member of a community that had initially viewed her with suspicion. She had learned that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as disasters, and that the courage to start over can lead to endings more beautiful than any fairy tale. As the Montana sun set behind the mountains and the lights of their home glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, Millie Harper Callahan knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The loneliness that had once threatened to consume her had been replaced by the deep satisfaction of belonging, of being needed and wanted and loved for exactly who she was. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying new dreams and new possibilities toward the horizon. But Millie no longer needed to board those trains to find her future. She had found it here in the strong arms of a man who had learned to love again, in the bright laughter of a child who called her Mama, and in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that home is not a place you find, but something you build with your own hands and heart. Clara May's voice drifted from the kitchen where she was helping set the table for supper, singing one of the lullabies that Millie had taught her. Richard's boots echoed on the porch as he returned from the barn, and the familiar sounds of their evening routine began to weave themselves into the fabric of another ordinary, extraordinary day. And in that moment, surrounded by the life she had helped to create, and the love she had earned through trial and perseverance, Millie knew that every difficult step of her journey had been leading her here to this place, to these people, to the profound joy of being exactly who she was meant to be. The stars were beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky, distant lights that had witnessed countless human dramas of love and loss, hope and despair, endings and beginnings. They would shine down on Willow Creek long after the current generation had passed into memory. But for now, they illuminated a story of redemption and second chances, of the courage to trust again, and the wisdom to recognize love in all its many forms. In the little house at the end of the rutted road, where a family had been forged from the ashes of loneliness and the faith to believe in, tomorrow the lights burned warm and bright against the darkness, a beacon of hope for anyone brave enough to believe that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, life gives you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it most.